Okay, good morning. I'm John Talbot, the CEO of the California Milk Advisory Board, and I'm pleased to kick off the first of two consumer product-oriented discussions. The first will look at the aftermath of one of the most disruptive years in the history of retail sales. John Crawford is here to share the data and his thoughts on the impact of COVID-19 on dairy product sales and what the future may hold. John Crawford is a leader in the dairy vertical for IRI as VP of Client Insights. He leads the IRI relationship for a number of top dairy manufacturers and dairy industry associations. John is a seasoned consumer product marketer with over 22 years of industry experience. John's career encompasses an extensive combination of marketing leadership, innovation, new product development, market research, and category management. Prior to joining IRI, John led marketing and innovation efforts at Crystal Farms and held several marketing positions at Land O'Lakes. John holds a bachelor's degree in political science and economics from the University of Southern California and an MBA in marketing from the USC Marshall School of Business. John, over to you. And as a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and John will answer those all at the end.
Thank you, John. I am thrilled to be here speaking with you, the California Creamery Operators Association. Really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. We are going to take a look at, as John said, the most disruptive year we've seen in retail sales in probably since the Great Depression. And it'll be interesting to kind of look at what actually happened to consumer behavior during the pandemic. And then where do we think consumer behavior is going now? We're going to look at what consumers said they were going to do when the economy's all reopened, and when people got vaccinated. And then we'll look at what the data shows in terms of what is actually happening when we look at the data through June of this year. So it'll be very interesting to kind of see what we thought was going to happen, what we thought the consumer behaviors, that the changes that were going to stick, and whether or not we think they are going to stick. I always like to say that, the past recessions, if you think about the past recessions that we've all lived through, Americans have a very amazing ability to forget and to move on, right? And to kind of turn the page. But if you think back to the Great Depression and my grandparents, they pinched pennies their entire lives. And so the question that I always had coming into this pandemic was, would some of these behaviors stick? Would this really be a Great Depression, or would it be just like the recessions of 2008 or 1999, 1991 or 2001 or whatever recessions that we've had? So we'll take a look at that. Okay. And so the agenda, if it'll switch here. It did not switch. Give me one second. Oh, there it goes. Sorry about that. I need to be patient. So we're going to look a little bit food for thought. We'll look at the COVID impact on consumer behavior, and then we'll kind of take a look at, what are the total store trends showing us now through June, and kind of juxtaposition those versus 2020, the year end. We'll look at Dairy 15 trends, 15 dairy categories that we track, and again, look at those versus what we saw for all of 2020. We'll look at it for total US, and then we'll also look at it in California because there are some differences. And then we'll take a little bit of look into the future and kind of where we think this is going for 2020 and beyond. And then I will give you a plug to sign up for our industry leading thought leadership. We're doing some pretty exciting things on COVID tracking, and that is open to everybody who wants to sign up for it at iriworldwide.com. All right. So a little bit of a delay here on switching, so I'll be patient. Oh, there's a big delay. Okay. So a little bit of food for thought, and I have a big delay here, so I apologize for that. So first and foremost, consumers are beginning to return to pre-pandemic buying and eating patterns. I'll go ahead here. Here we go. And then total store trends have softened from year-end 2020, but are still well ahead of pre-pandemic rates. So when we look at 2021 versus 2020, you're going to see some softening. But when you look at 2021, versus 2019, you'll see it is much stronger. Early indications are the consumers that point to consumers short term. Yeah, thank you. I will go faster on the other one, and I don't have as many builds, so it won't be so bad. I apologize for that. So early indications are that consumers that we do have short-term memory. When you start to look at the what's happening with behaviors with the economy reopening, I'm in California as well, and certainly the economy is reopening. And boy, I like the Dodgers, and I watch the Dodger games, and it is completely full again. So it is amazing how quickly we've kind of returned to normal. I was telling, I went out to dinner in a restaurant and ate indoors for the first time in probably, in 18 months. And it was the longest 18 months, ever, right? The pandemic, but it seemed as if it was very quickly, like I had been there just the week before. So then with the pandemic normal, right, convenience growth is now starting to accelerate as consumers are returning to work and school, and travel patterns are starting to get back to normal behavior. So convenience that was down during the pandemic is coming back. E-commerce importance continues to increase, but the omni-channel shopper, the omni-channel shopper is really critical. The ones that are buying on e-commerce and buying in the store. Away from home eating, it returns to pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2021. So we actually saw a pretty even split between eating at home and eating out, and dollars spent out of home and in home. I think we're going to get back to that level here pretty soon. Plant-based foods are here to stay and expected to growth to accelerate as consumers return to pre-pandemic lifestyles and diets. Fresh and refrigerated categories have replaced center of store categories as the fastest growing categories and aisles in the store. So we saw center of store, we saw some processed categories that were starting to see some life, and that has changed back. And then deli prepared and bakery are improving as retailers reopen these departments. They were absolutely, completely hemorrhaging as those departments got closed down for sanitary safety reasons. And then low carb, vegan, vegetarian, dairy free, lactose free are returning to the top growing dairy claims, Dairy 15 claims. Consumers again are returning to normal. And then brands, this is a little bit different than what we saw from before. Brands are outperforming private label in 12 of the Dairy 15 categories, which is something that we did not see before. Private label was doing extremely well, and now we're seeing brands are kind of on the upswing here. So then we look at the impact on consumer behavior and some of the consumer lifestyle shifts. We have, the leisure and holidays, the change that's happened there. I'm going to just build this thing up here so it goes pretty quickly. So entertaining for the holidays, celebrations looked different, right? Smaller at-home gatherings. Folks were doing kind of drive-by celebrations, right? It was a very interesting dynamic. And now that people are being vaccinated, we're having more and more folks that are entertaining in their homes and are seeing family and friends again. Certainly, we upgraded our homes, right? We upgraded our homes inside and out, especially digitally. Outdoor spaces with gardens and cookery and kitchen appliances, streaming services. And you can tell that my Wi-Fi is probably not as good as it needs to be here. And shifting spending on from travel to dining to entertainment and in-home entertainment certainly transpired. And then you think about work and working out at home. So physical home spaces have changed to accommodate stay-at-home people working and doing school from home, and then shifting spending to home connectivity and workspaces. And then consumption shifts. There's more spending at home versus away from home. We know that, and increased in cleaning, right? That was all happening during COVID. And then shopping shifts, increased adoption of e-commerce, fewer trips, bigger baskets, less product discovery in store was happening, right? And so these consumer shifts happened during COVID, and the question becomes which of those will stick. So when we talked about much of our entertaining shifted to screens, a couple of things to look at here. We had 12 million people attend Fortnite's Travis Scott concert in April of 2020. Grocery retailers were doing the cooking, the holiday cooking. Energy drinks and snack subscriptions started to appeal to gamers. And parties were having these virtual drive-by parties that we talked about a little bit. And then consumers spent a lot of money on their homes. With movies, theaters being closed and streaming services, we saw a 37% increase in streaming services in 2020. We saw some interesting things. Somebody like a Hershey's S'mores marketed kind of a s'mores basket for fun in the backyard, so kind of more entertaining at home. And then we saw, working and working out at home. We saw some changes that were happening there. Work and commute tips naturally, stayed 30 to 40% below. And we saw home sales of fitness and equipment growing by more than 40% and hitting, almost $10 billion. And then consumption shifts at home. I'll slow down from what's over here. Sorry about that. So consumers, were reintroduced into the kitchen, right, during COVID. And 53% reported that they would continue to create meals from scratch more than pre-pandemic. Now that will probably likely shift a little bit, but they were 80% of consumers were preparing over 70% of their meals at home. And so we saw that play out in some of the data in terms of some of the products that consumers were buying. And then Tyson launched, this instant pot kits. There were some meal kits that were happening. It'll be interesting to see if those stick or not. And so then we were talking about what consumer behavior is shifting. So we saw spices increase 32%, flour increased 30%, baking needs increased 29%, and then natural cheese, butter, cream cheese, and sour cream. You think about core baking and cooking ingredients, that really started to resonate with consumers. And so we saw some of these really kind of staple categories do extremely well during COVID and during the shelter at home periods. And then you had, when you looked at it by generations, you actually saw Gen Z and millennials. And one of the things that we talked about kind of coming into this, and we talked about it before the pandemic happened, was, millennials and Gen Z really didn't know how to cook. And so the question became, well, during this pandemic, did this force them to learn how to cook? And I think the answer was yes. And when you start to see what some Gen Z and millennials were buying, you see spices and seasoning 3 and 4 for Gen Z, and you see flour and meal, and then refrigerated biscuits and dough for the millennials. So the question again becomes, will that stick for consumers? Will consumers continue to do that? Will millennials and Gen Z stay there? And the answer is we certainly hope so. And then the big winners during COVID were actually grocery. You think about grocery and how it was doing before the pandemic. We know that mass merch was doing extremely well. So the Walmarts and the Targets of the world were doing extremely well. Club was doing well, but club and grocery were the big winners, and along with e-commerce. We see convenience being down, and certainly we've seen that rebound more recently. And so when you talk about e-commerce, we'll spend a little bit of time on e-commerce here and look at what we're seeing there. There were quite a bit of new folks that came in for e-commerce. You had a number of folks that tried e-commerce shopping for grocery with this pandemic, and it was interesting. Of the new shoppers that came in, 50% of them said they would continue to buy online, with only 20% of them becoming heavy users. I'm wondering if I shift over to this and just call it a day. Let me try something here. I apologize. Can we shift this over to this screen, folks? Let's do that. This might go a lot faster if I do it this way. I won't be able to see everything, but we can go much quicker, hopefully. And my apologies. Holler at me if this is going better or not. Okay, so holler at me. Now I can't see what's going on the screen, so I apologize. So pre-COVID, we saw the e-commerce folks, 65% came in that were shopping very, very shallowly. 23% shopped e-commerce 4 to 9 times, and 12% shopped e-commerce 10 plus times. That all kind of flowed out here. And what we saw over here was that 50% of e-commerce shoppers continue to buy online, with 20% of them becoming heavy users. So the flows here are a little bit complex, but that's the big thing, that 50% of these new e-commerce shoppers said they would continue to buy online, with 20% of them becoming heavy users. And then the big holy grail here, and if you talk about what Target talks about here, is the in-store shopper. The in-store only shopper spends 100% in-store. They're 94% of the shoppers. Their growth spend versus a year ago is 12% increase. The e-commerce only shopper, 100% spent online, 1.7% of shoppers, 8% growth versus a year ago. But that omni-channel shopper, the one that's doing both, 29% online average, 4.3% of shopper, and growth of 18%. And Target says over time, omni-channel shop guests spend an average of 4 times more than a store-only guest, and nearly 10 times more than a digital-only guest. And hopefully my screen is advancing a little bit quicker here. And then shoppers are consolidating their purchases with major e-commerce retailers. If you kind of looked over here, you see what was happening a year ago, and it was a little more fragmented with this 27.5% of all other. Instacart was a big winner here, 11.3% up to 17%. Major grocery retailers online were big winners. Target was a big winner. Amazon lost a little bit, and Walmart kind of held its own, a little bit of growth. But you saw that this all other really shrink. And so on the edible side of it, it was really a lot of consolidation in kind of the big players of e-commerce. And then e-commerce shoppers are more loyal. They're highly loyal to their brands. They're more loyal than the in-store shopper. And so for brands, e-commerce becomes a very important channel for brands to win in. And then e-commerce increased across all cohorts. So income cohorts over here, you see all income cohorts. You saw these pretty big increases happening across low, middle, and high incomes, and even low incomes. You saw a 2.6 point change. And then the generation cohorts, even the 66 plus generations, a 2.7 point increase across the time periods ending February of 2021. So getting back to these lifestyles, the same slide as before, the question becomes, what's going to stick? Well, I would say that painting at home is likely to stick, and certainly part of the working at home is going to stick, as we've invested in our homes. And certainly, we know that returning to the office is not going to be the same as it was pre-pandemic, so that will certainly stick. Consumption shifts, that's going to shift back. We're going to go back to away from home eating. There's no question about that. Certainly cleaning supplies are not going to be as hard to find as they were before. I know you can find hand sanitizer readily now. And then shopping shifts, I think you're going to see some of the e-commerce stick for sure. You're going to see some of the shifting behaviors, but I think you're going to see a lot of return to kind of where we were before with C-store increasing, probably mass merchandisers increasing again, and grocery probably struggling a little bit more. And so then when we asked consumers back in March, kind of, okay, once people are vaccinated and we return to normal and the economy's reopened, what are you going to do more? And certainly socializing with friends and family in person was the big one. Traveling, going to gym and fitness classes, following a diet and eating plan more closely is very important there. Dining out in restaurants. So when we start to think about returning to pre-pandemic diets, pay attention to what's going to be happening there. All right, so now we'll go into the total store trends, and we'll go pretty quickly here. What we saw in 2021 was a softening of last year panic buy period. So total store is up 4.6%, edibles up 5.4%. At the end of the year last year, total store was up 10.4% and edibles was up 13%. So we continue to see some softening as we wrapped on those panic buy numbers and those big shelter at home numbers. But we certainly do expect it to stay, well elevated over 2019, the pre-pandemic period. So then when you start to look at it by channel, this is what we were talking about, where food was winning. So food was outpacing multi-outlet plus convenience, which is what MULO plus C is. And was outpacing mass with Walmart, and was outpacing convenience, right? Now food is lagging. It's still up from where it was pre-pandemic, but you see convenience really coming back here, now up 6%. And at year end, convenience was only up 2.8%. And so then when we looked at the departments, and we look at the departments now, and what we saw during the pandemic is we saw growth within general food. We saw high growth within frozen. We saw, general food is kind of center of store departments. And we saw deli prepared and bakery being very far down on the right-hand side over here. These departments are all, the same kind of ranking here, but we're starting to see refrigerated come back. We're seeing bakery come back. Deli prepared is much less down than it was before as those have reopened. And we saw beverages and deli meat surpass frozen and liquor. And liquor was kind of up at the top here for a long time, as we well know. But beverages and deli meat are now outpacing frozen and liquor through June. And then when we start to look at the size aisles, so liquor is now the largest aisle ahead of dairy. Dairy used to be the largest aisle, but liquor has surpassed it and is actually stretching its lead a little bit. But if you look at dairy being, vastly bigger than the next aisle of snacks, right? And so when you think about salty snacks and center of store snacks, and then when you look at the growing categories, you see fresh and refrigerated have replaced center of store and frozen. And so you're seeing fresh here in the green categories, whether it be seafood, lamb, beef, or deli meat, and you're seeing refrigerated in desserts and meals and other refrigerated and baked goods and refrigerated beverages showing up here. So we started to see a shift back again to these normal kind of pre-pandemic eating behaviors where folks were looking for fresh foods and we're looking for refrigerated foods. So good news for dairy. And then looking at the top categories, we certainly had, this doesn't change. This has not changed. A little bit of re-ranking here. But notice, and we're talking about with convenience, so you have a little bit of that going with beer and carbonated beverages, salty snacks, and bottled water, convenience driven. But here you got milk and here you got natural cheese, right? So two of the biggest categories are still within dairy, within milk and natural cheese. And so we know milk has been, down to some extent. Natural cheese has been a very positive during the pandemic, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. But milk, saw some nice growth here during the pandemic, and we need to see how we can kind of capture and hang on to that. And when you looked at the growth now, it has changed quite a bit. You got premixed cocktails, so that's part of the liquor piece, and now with people kind of entertaining a little bit more. But you see refrigerated come back in here, so refrigerated side dishes. You see fresh refrigerated tea and coffee. You see fresh fish, fresh chicken, fresh ribs, fresh beef. And it was interesting, at the end of the year, we saw spices, flour, and baking needs were still top of this list for year end. So now we're seeing, again, these fresh categories really starting to kind of win back with consumers. All right, now we'll look at the Dairy 15 trends. The Dairy 15 is 15 dairy categories that we track. It's the traditional dairy categories. We add in ice cream and frozen novelties. We also add in refrigerated dips and refrigerated desserts to the kind of the traditional ones. We exclude eggs from this view because it can skew the data quite a bit. And so when you look at the top growing, the top categories, these are the same as they've been. Refrigerated dips and margarine and sour cream are the ones, so refrigerated dips past sour cream and dollar sales. The declining categories now, and we saw butter and margarine actually were big winning categories during the pandemic. Processed cheese, which had been down for many, many years, is still seeing some growth. So there's some positivity there. But you're seeing cottage cheese, margarine, and spreads in the total U.S. and butter are starting to see some struggling numbers here. Natural cheese has been the most dynamic category for a while, and you're seeing frozen novelties and ice cream and sherbet are winning the day, and you'll see a little bit more of that in California. And then the top growing subcategories, really quickly, you see refrigerated skim and low-fat milk, and I talk to retailers all the time about this. You know, we know that this is a declining category, we've got it, but it is still the largest category. So it is a category you cannot, just ignore. Refrigerated whole milk certainly is a good category. It has been growing, but I always caution retailers not to kind of sleep on refrigerated skim and low fat milk, and we know that they've kind of cut back on shelf space for that at the expense of some of the growing almond milks and whatnot. So I think that there's a balance there, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the top growing categories: natural cheese shredded, natural cheese slices, natural cheese chunks. And natural cheese snack is up here a little bit further down, but now you're seeing things come back that were here before the pandemic. Refrigerated almond milk coming back in here. Refrigerated pudding and gelatins are coming back in here. Refrigerated milk substitutes all other. That's oat milk mainly driving that. And so you're seeing kind of pre-pandemic eating behaviors start to come back. And then brand, this includes private label, but you're seeing brand is seeing strong replacing private label on the top 10 growing list. When we looked at this pre-pandemic, private label had almost all of these top growing categories, and now it only has a few. And when you talk about coming back to pre-pandemic periods, right, with Too Good yogurt and Planet Oat coming back into the top 15 here, they were nowhere to be found. You saw Land O'Lakes butter up here. You saw private label butter up here. You saw Kraft singles was up here, right? So you saw a lot of those categories for folks that were when they were sheltered at home and cooking at home. And then when you remove private label out of this, you start to see some interesting things come back in here. You see Almond Breeze come in here. You see Sargento come in here into the top categories. Land O'Lakes butter is still a big one. Kraft singles is still a big one, but both declining. And then you see again, you saw a couple of yogurts come back in here. And so yogurt struggled during the pandemic as folks weren't going to school and weren't going to work, right? And a big portion of yogurt category is single serve. So to see Too Good yogurt and Chobani Flip yogurt come back into the top growing categories is a very positive sign for yogurt. And then looking at branded versus private label, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I always like to look at kind of the share of branded versus private label. And I guess I growing up looking at milk categories and cheese categories with such a big private label share, I always thought that this was kind of consistent across all of dairy. But when you look at margarine and spreads, right, private label is very small. When you look at yogurt, private label is very small. So ice cream and sherbet and frozen novelties, private label is very small. And actually, private label is only outpacing brand categories, and currently through June. That's 6 fewer than they were at the end of the year, and actually even more fewer than they were before the pandemic. Okay, and then when we look at claims, interesting on the claims, most of the same claims are here from where they were at the end of the year. Interesting that soy-free came in here for Dairy 15 claims on pack. We see the animal diet, vegetarian, grass-fed animal feed, vegetarian and vegan diets are certainly up here, GMO free, low sugar, no added sugar, and lactose free actually moved up 2 spaces here since the end of the year in total US. Now we'll quickly look at California. When we look at California, there are some differences, right? So California is outperforming the total US in 10 of the 15 categories. So when you look at these numbers here, 10 of these are stronger. In 10 of these categories, it's stronger than it was in the total US. Refrigerated dips is actually the smallest. We saw cottage cheese, I believe, was the smallest down here. But in California, it's refrigerated dips, and you see some other cottage cheese is a little bit more important here within California. When you look at the growing categories, pretty similar here with butter and margarine being the declining categories, but you see cottage cheese is actually growing within California. And then the subcategories, again, refrigerated low-fat skim milk, the largest category, just barely ahead of ice cream and frozen novelties at this point, but some bigger declines that are happening here. Refrigerated whole milk, refrigerated yogurt is obviously a very big category and starting to see growth again. Butter, almond milk actually down a little bit. And then when you look at the top growing categories, you see refrigerated whole milk in here. You see yogurt drinks. We don't see yogurt drinks showing up ever in the total US, but in California, yogurt drinks are showing up. And so you're seeing, yogurt show up in here and refrigerated yogurt drinks are the top growing category. So again, another positive sign for the yogurt category. And then looking at brands with private label in California, Lactaid, Sargento, Almond Breeze are top brands in California that weren't top brands in the total US. And then you look at the top growing brands and you got Altadena, you got Berkeley Farms, you got Tillamook, you got Crystal Creamery. Not surprising, some of the West Coast brands and some of the California brands are showing up strong here, but some really good, good brands to be driving here for manufacturers and dairy within California. So some positive signs here. And then removing it, same thing here happening, but Lactaid becomes the 5th largest brand up here. So the 5th largest brand when you remove private label. And then now you get Horizon Organic, skim and whole milk showing up here in the top 15. So within California, again, we don't see Horizon Organic showing up in the total US numbers. And then Too Good and Planet Oats. So now those two brands that showed up in the total US show up in California as well as the top growing brands. And then interestingly enough, and maybe you know this better than I do, I thought it was surprising that brand playing even more are more important in California than they are in the total US. Whipped toppings being a huge exception. We talked about milk and natural cheese before, but these numbers, the private label share numbers, are a lot smaller in California than they were in the total US. And private label is outpacing branded in only one category in California. And that one category is refrigerated whipped toppings. So where we saw it was outpacing in 3 in total US, it's only 1 here in California. So brands are winning the day right now in California. And then the claims in California, same claims for the most part. Omega-3 shows up here at number 6 as a claim, and antibiotic-free shows up here. And then digestive health shows up. So those 3 are different from what we saw in the total US numbers that we're seeing in California. So kind of unique to California. So you start to think about the Fairlife omega-3 piece and some other, some omega-3s, and then your digestive health for your probiotics and prebiotics and yogurt. There's some positives being seen here. Okay. The crystal ball and beyond, just to check on my time here. I know I'm getting there at the end here. We'll get this done in 5 minutes, and we'll leave 5 minutes for questions. So hopefully that we're advancing the slides faster here. So when we looked at CPG demand surge, right? So during at the end of the year here, CPG edibles, including perishables, was up 9.2%, right? So we know that, and we know it's going to decline versus 2020, but it's going to be up versus 2019. When you look at in-home versus out-of-home, so in-home is blue, out-of-home is red. Certainly, obviously, when the pandemic hit and we were all sheltered at home, boy, that spike happened pretty big. It started to level out a little bit. We saw when the winter spike started to happen and we kind of sheltered at home again, that started to go back up again. But we expect that by the end of this year, that will get back to kind of where it was here back in pre-pandemic periods. So when you talk about vaccinations, this is certainly a positive sign for reopening the economy. Back in November, before vaccinations were even out here, only 21% said they planned to get it as soon as they could. 18% said they would wait a few months, and 9% said they'd wait at least 6 months. It started to evolve as we started to see vaccines were coming closer, and then when they started to hit, and 3% in January, got vaccinated, and we started to see these numbers increase. And then now when you look at it here with 73%, and this is a consumer survey that we're taking. So 73% of the consumers said they have had at least one shot of the vaccination. And you're starting to see these folks that said, no, I'm not going to get it at all. And certainly the no, I'm not sure if I'm going to get it shrinking. So some positive information for getting vaccinated and getting these economies to stay open, right? So being able to stay at this, keep the Dodger games full, right? And keep these restaurants open and driving some consumers to come into the restaurants. And so then macroeconomic conditions have improved quite a bit. We saw negative GDP growth, not surprising in 2020, but now we're seeing some pretty positive GDP growth and starting to see some forecasts for pretty good GDP growth. Unemployment rates are down. We expect them to get back down into this 5% range from where it was in calendar year. It was up at 8.1. Spending's been increasing. Consumer confidence, which was high as we came into the pandemic and really cratered. And then we certainly saw, it's starting to tick back up here. And by Q4, we expect it to be kind of back up to almost, 90, a little north of 90%. And then the stimulus that happened here in January, we started to see that was led to an increase in discretionary purchases. The stimuluses of last year really were spent on, kind of healthcare, that were spent on groceries, they were spent on kind of staples, they were spent on rent. But we're seeing this to be a little bit more spent on discretionary. It's being spent in food and beverage, but it's also being spent on other retail. And then gasoline, is starting to see some increase. And so we're starting to see some travel plans. I don't know. I should say we're not starting to see it. Travel is absolutely kind of back. I know that planes are completely full. And it'll take a little while for the airline industry to kind of get back and getting all their flights back on schedule here. And American Airlines, starting to rehire some of the folks that they let go. But certainly we expect travel spending to increase, and entertainment spending to increase, and that's certainly going to take away from at-home food spending. And so then we talked about this, that's that same chart that we saw from before, but now we're starting to project it. So we expect by the end of this year, we'll be at about 50-50 spend on away from home and in-home consumption. So we're kind of getting back to where we were pre-pandemic by the end of this year. And then mobility, consumer mobility was the biggest driver of what was happening with food and beverage volume at home. Obviously, as consumer mobility cratered, and this is Google mobility, as we all were sheltered at home and not traveling and not leaving our homes. Certainly that had a mirror image of what was happening on in-home spending. And so that was the largest driver of actual in-home spending. For the first time, we kind of had this unforecasted inability to kind of impact what was driving consumption levels. And so that's going to change as mobility increases, and that will certainly impact food and beverage volume. And then when you start to look at, and we'll say June vaccine here, because we're certainly a June vaccine. When we did this, it was, would the vaccine be here in June or December? When you start to see versus 2020, 2021, we're expected to be down total omnichannel about 3.7%, but up versus 2019, 11%. And e-commerce is still expected to win the day, certainly softening, but up versus 2019, up at 92%. So e-commerce is still going to win the day. And now we expect, obviously, convenience to rebound, as we talked about already. Okay, so some implications for dairy. There are numerous competing factors at play that will impact the future of dairy. Certainly, this shift from in-home to back to away from home is going to be critical. CPG expected to decline in 2021, but stay well above 2019 levels. Early indicators point to consumers' short-term memory behaviors and quickly returning to pre-pandemic normal. Monitor and support lasting consumer behavior changes, right? Remote work, younger consumers, newfound cooking and baking. If we can continue to enhance that and cultivate that, I think that'll be really powerful for us in the dairy industry. Home improvement, home celebrations, and so self and social care. Certainly, those are some of the consumer behavior changes we expect to kind of stick a little bit. And then 2022 is expected to look very much like pre-COVID growth in at home versus away from home. We saw that get back to kind of pre-pandemic levels at the end of 2021. So expect 2022 to look much more like 2019 than any other year, and be prepared to capitalize on food service growth, and be prepared to innovate at retail to keep consumers, focused on what's going on in dairy at retail. Incorporate macro and uncontrollable trends into your future demand forecasting. We're doing a lot of work with Google Mobility and how that's going to impact, how that impacts demand forecasting, looking at macroeconomic trends and how that impacts demand forecasting. So just you need to start to take into account uncontrollable trends and what that might be in your business. Channel strategy is going to be critical to capture future shopping behavior, particularly with emphasis on club, dollar, and e-commerce. And then the Dairy 15 innovation is going to return to pre-pandemic levels, but shelf space is going to be harder to obtain, right? It's going to be a lot harder to get on shelf as some of the bigger brands have kind of started to win at shelf. And then closely monitor consumers getting back to pre-pandemic COVID diets and how they evolved. Expect plant-based, keto, and paleo to reemerge. It kind of went away a little bit during the pandemic, but it's coming back with a vengeance right now. And then defend and retain shelf space for faster moving core items against the SKU proliferation that happens with trendy growing but slower moving items. So I like to say, I buy 2% half gallon white milk, right? And it's out of stock 1 out of probably 3 times that I go to the store, go to my store, but I can get 4 different brands of oat milk and 5 different varieties of each of those brands. And so, has that balance tipped completely the other way? And I think that it has. And so we really need to get that story out in front of retailers to say, look, you don't want to be out of stock on your fastest moving items. You don't want to be out of stock on strawberry Chobani Greek yogurt at the expense of, your 5th plant-based yogurt, right? So, and that concludes it. So again, our industry leading thought leadership, there's a lot out there on our website. I'll just leave you with this. You can go to iriworldwide.com and subscribe to Insights there, and you will get emails on every thought leadership piece that we do kind of on COVID. And with that, thank you. I apologize if everything was really delayed here. My apologies, and we'll go look at some questions here. If I can see it. Oops. Okay. All right, hopefully that worked. Thank you, Maddie, for the 5-minute warning. I couldn't see it anymore, so I apologize. I know I'm at time here. Have consumers been sensitive to methane emission claims? Yes. There's no question if you think about those animal diet claims and animal welfare claims. Yes, certainly methane. I always struggle with this a little bit. I don't know how, cows are the bane of the entire, ozone depletion and global warming. When you look at, potentially, global emissions that happen out of China, right? So I think that's pretty interesting. But yes, they certainly are. That certainly is something to consider. I think, the water usage on dairy milk versus almond milk, I think is something that we need to be telling that story as well. So yes, it is something that folks are looking at. It is something that we need to at least be aware of. Beyond the next 2 years, what do I think the next big consumer trends are going to be? Yeah, I don't know if you want me to tell you what I think it's going to be. It's going to be plant-based, and I think it's going to be plant-based cheese. So you think about the size of the cheese category. Plant-based is about 12% of milk now. The total milk category, it's about less than 1% of cheese. There's such a huge ability potentially for plant-based to kind of win in cheese. So I do think that that's it. I think dairy, I think lactose-free, I think extended shelf life, I think communicating the benefits. I've talked to the industry for a while now. I think assuming that consumers know that it's a good source of calcium and a good source of vitamin D and a good source of protein, I don't think that they do know that. I don't think younger consumers actually do know that. So I think that messaging needs to be out there. And I think we need to make sure we're messaging on the whole package, right? To have a gallon of milk with just a sticker on it is wasted space. So you look at what Fairlife has done, and I think that's certainly something that we need to pay attention to. I like this question here. can we grow in dairy and liquor category? Yeah, I think it's a very interesting. I think it's a very interesting idea. I think extending dairy out into other categories and having dairy be a component of other categories, and particularly fluid dairy, I think is a very interesting idea and the way to go. I would say that, you know, back in the day, I worked on a brand of egg whites, liquid egg whites, and we actually developed something called the Proteini, which was a protein shake, and we kind of used that Proteini and went to bars to say, hey, you should put egg whites in some of your martinis and give folks, you know, a shot of protein. So yeah, I think there's a real interesting way to do that. I guess you think about, you know, the White Russians of the world, and are there other drinks that we can develop? So yeah, I think it's a really good idea, as liquor is certainly going to continue to win the day. I will stop there. I apologize for delays. I hope it was valuable. Certainly you can email me with any questions that you might have. And I will let you know that the next event that you're having is a panel discussion on the culture of innovation, and John Talbot's going to be on that. So I thank you for your time. I apologize for going a little bit long. I apologize for the delay, but it was a real pleasure speaking with you.